Your four favorites are All That Jazz, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. My top choice for you is The Mitchells vs. the Machines. It's an animated film like Fantastic Mr. Fox and Nausicaä. It's got this fun, zany, chaotic energy like Scott Pilgrim. And your Letterboxd log for Scott Pilgrim says, "This movie made me who I am, but like in a gay way." And the protagonist of this film is gay. And she's an aspiring filmmaker, and the protagonist of All That Jazz is a filmmaker in addition to being a choreographer, stage director, and dancer. Another one of my top choices for you is Speed Racer. This one may not be animated, but it's based on a manga series like Nausicaä. It's got gorgeous cinematography like All That Jazz. It's got this colorful, maximalist energy like Scott Pilgrim and has this sort of video game vibe with fun transitions. It has to do with family like Fantastic Mr. Fox. And like Nausicaä, the protagonist feels like a hero while being surrounded by corruption, destruction, and/or greed. And Redline reminds me a lot of Speed Racer, and this one's animated like two of your favorites. Speaking of animated films, Mind Game is based on a manga series like Nausicaä. It explores existential themes like All That Jazz, and it's got humor and a maximalist style like Scott Pilgrim. Speaking of existential themes and animation, I also want to recommend Soul, and the protagonist of this film is a musician like Scott Pilgrim. Belladonna of Sadness is an animated film like two of your favorites, but it also has this exaggerated visual style like Scott Pilgrim and moments that feel like fantasy like All That Jazz. The Red Shoes, like All That Jazz, is about performance and obsession. Like Scott Pilgrim, it involves romance and jealousy. Like Nausicaä, it feels like the protagonist has a calling, but in this film her calling is dance, and in Nausicaä her calling is to protect nature. And like Fantastic Mr. Fox, it feels like the protagonist is torn between their calling and domestic life, because Mr. Fox promised Mrs. Fox that he'd choose a safer job for the sake of his family, but he still longs for his days as a thief. And in this film, the protagonist is forced to choose between dance and marriage. Birdman, like All That Jazz, involves the staging of a theatrical production. Like Scott Pilgrim, it's very stylized. Like Fantastic Mr. Fox, it feels like the protagonist is unable to escape the persona they've created. Mr. Fox sees himself as the clever thief fox, even as a father. And in Birdman, Regan is unable to separate himself from his identity as a former superhero actor. The Truman Show, like All That Jazz, blurs the line between life and performance. Like Scott Pilgrim, reality feels artificially constructed because Scott Pilgrim follows video game logic and Truman's life is a TV show, he just doesn't know it. And like Nausicaä, the protagonist is trying to better understand their environment. The main characters in Why Don't You Play in Hell are filmmakers like in All That Jazz, and it's got this hyper-stylized, maximalist video game energy like Scott Pilgrim. Hundreds of Beavers also has that video game energy like Scott Pilgrim, and it feels like the main character is living his life on a loop, kind of like how in All That Jazz we keep seeing Joe Gideon's morning routine every day. Like Fantastic Mr. Fox, there's a conflict between humans and animals, and like Nausicaä, there's this feeling of surviving in nature. Speaking of conflicts between humans and animals, Chicken Run is an animated film that I think has a similar vibe to Fantastic Mr. Fox. And since I mentioned that idea of it feeling like life is on a loop, I also want to recommend Run Lola Run, which feels like a video game like Scott Pilgrim. Galaxy Quest involves that blurred line between identity and performance like All That Jazz. It's got comedy and a sense of adventure like Scott Pilgrim. And like Nausicaä, it feels like the characters are assuming these sort of mythic, heroic roles. I do this every time someone has All That Jazz in their four favorites and doesn't have these two movies marked as watched. But in All That Jazz, Joe Gideon is staging a musical while working on a film he directed called The Stand-Up. But the movie's semi-autobiographical, and the musical that Bob Fosse was working on was Chicago, which was then adapted into a 2002 movie. And the real-life equivalent of The Stand-Up is his movie Lenny. And I think seeing both of those movies helps deepen the appreciation of All That Jazz. People tend to compare All That Jazz to 8.5 because they're both semi-autobiographical films with elements of fantasy. But I also think you might enjoy Opening Night since you're a fan of All That Jazz. Holy Motors also involves fantasy and performance while exploring themes of identity and mortality like All That Jazz. And it has an extravagant visual style like Scott Pilgrim. Josie and the Pussycats, like Scott Pilgrim, was based on comics and the characters are musicians. Wreck-It Ralph is an animated film like Fantastic Mr. Fox and Nausicaä, and it's about identity like All That Jazz, and it follows video game logic like Scott Pilgrim. Defending Your Life is about mortality like All That Jazz. It's got elements of romance and comedy like Scott Pilgrim. Like Fantastic Mr. Fox, Meryl Streep is one of the stars. And like Nausicaä, it's a fantasy.